Thank you and welcome to our new studio. I'm in the cafeteria. I don't know if it's echoing. There's nobody here except for Carolyn. Thanks to Carolyn for helping me out. We got sidetracked. We were trying to experiment with multiple cameras and whatnot. This is the easy part. Learning Zoom and trying to do a little cooking show is a little bit more challenging, but it's super fun and exciting. So thank you everyone for joining us. It's our second video or our second Zoom meeting. It will be every Friday. I won't be the only person doing them. Probably it will be me for the next week or two, and then we'll have some of the staff coming in. If anyone's interested in doing a guest appearance, let me know, reach out, shoot me an email. Maybe we could have some social distancing properly executed, but have some guests come in. So today's recipe, super simple. I love banana bread. We sell this one in the cafe. Like I said, I've been making this since 1994. Quick shout out to Rodney Weddle, executive pastry chef at the Ritz-Carlton when I worked there. Currently runs the bakehouse at Latour, creating dozens and dozens of incredible products still. And like I said, I've made this every place I've ever worked ever since, even when I owned a bakery in LA. Very, very simple. I made a few modifications today to make it easier. For example, I've never used a blender before, but I'm going to make just a nice smooth puree. But you can do it by hand. You can use a food processor, or you can use a KitchenAid mixer or small stand mixer or hand beater, whatever works for you best. So if you'll see the ingredients at the top, that has the banana puree. Here are some bananas. These are all overripe, really, really nice. And I made a note in there, the riper, the better. If you keep them in the fridge or you keep them out, once they've gotten to the overripe stage, you can peel them and pack them and freeze them. I had a bunch in the freezer. You can see these were out of the freezer, and it'll leach out a little bit of liquid, but it still works great. So you don't have to make banana bread as soon as you have 2 or 3 bananas left over. Just freeze them, and then when you have enough to make the recipe, you're good to go. If they're unripe or not quite ripe, just getting some spots on them. One trick that you can do, I wrote it on there, put them in the oven, about 350, 20 minutes or so, skin on, and bake them, and they'll swell up a little bit. They'll turn black. The inside will steam and get really nice and soft. Pull them out, let them cool, and then you can peel them and use them just like you would an overripe banana. So that being said, let's look at the ingredients that we have to utilize. We had a second camera set up here, so we've got baking soda. That didn't end up working. The bananas, sugar, I put on the recipe brown or granulated. I almost always use granulated. It's just a cost issue. Oil or butter, vegetable oil or butter. Today I'm using butter, but I have some oil scaled here. The trick with the butter, just make sure that it's melted and still a little bit warm. You don't want to add that with cold eggs or partially frozen banana puree, and then the butter will solidify. So it's important that everything stay liquefied. Eggs, of course. I don't know if you can see it. This says heavy cream. It's supposed to be milk or buttermilk. Buttermilk is the ideal, but I didn't have any milk, so I took some cream that I had and I added 4 parts water and 1 part cream, basically creating the same thing, maybe a little higher fat content. Some salt and the flour. So very, very simple. So for the recipe that I'm doing with the blender, I always recommend you put your liquid ingredients in first. So we've got all of that, the banana puree, the milk. And this is a pretty large blender. It might not work if you have a smaller one at home. The eggs, the butter, baking soda, the salt, and the sugar.
Chef Dan, I have a question.
Yeah.
Bonnie is asking, can you use almond milk?
Yeah, absolutely. You could use water if you wanted to. You could use water, soy milk, egg replacer if you wanted to go vegetarian. There's a lot of different options here. So that sort of brings us back to what we did last week. We talked about the role of ingredients. So as long as you have some form of liquid in there, that's great. What the original recipe called for with the buttermilk is the acidity from the buttermilk works together in tandem with the baking soda, and that gives you your leavening. right? Sort of like the old volcano vinegar and baking soda creates that leavening. You don't get as much leavening with regular milk or probably the almond milk. But what I don't recommend is that you switch to using baking powder. It makes it a little too light. I prefer this nice and dense. If you wanted a lighter cake, switch from the baking soda to the baking powder. But I prefer like the denser, more moist type of banana bread. So this will get loud for just a second. It should blend up real well for us. And then you always want to check to make sure it did blend up smooth. So if those are nice and right, we've got a little bit of liquid and juice from the bananas. There's not enough dry ingredients in this mix to make it tasty. So with the eggs in the milk in the bottom and the banana puree, it should be enough to make a nice smooth batter. Actually, it's like a smoothie, really. And then we can just transfer that into a larger bowl. You would not want to try to finish it in a blender because then you're adding the flour. It will bind up and become a problem. It wouldn't mix it. And like I said, this is probably a 3-quart, 4-quart blender. If you have a smaller blender at home, you might need to do it in 2 batches or transfer it back and forth. So. All right. Normally I would be tasting it with my fingers, but I don't want to do that today. You can have tasting spoons along the way. But even in baking, not unlike cooking, you want to taste as you go. If you forgot to put in sugar or you forgot to put in a particular ingredient, there's a lot of times that you can taste it and recognize, it needs a little more salt, needs a little bit more of something else, or something that you forgot. There's still time for you to fix it. That's the challenge with baking. A lot of people get scared or wary of baking because once it goes into the oven, there's nothing you can do. And then it comes out an hour and a half later and you spent 3 hours on something that doesn't turn out. So you can eliminate a lot of those errors if you actually take the time to taste it as you go. But since no one's tasting this today, even if I forgot something, I'll still be okay. Now, the last thing I have is the flour. And the technique that I'm going to show you is a folding technique. It's very common. It's generally done with a spatula, but in this case, I'm using a stiff whisk or French whisk. And the technique there is to just gently turn the bowl and fold the flour in. What we don't want to do is go crazy whisking it. Because like with the cookies last week and like with almost anything baking, as you add liquid, any form of liquid, moisture to flour, and you start to stir it, it generates or creates gluten, which is the structure that we want, but we don't want too much, so we want to be nice and gentle. So here I'm just turning it and kind of going from the bottom, folding it over. Just a gentle turn, like that. And it'll start to incorporate very quickly. You can see, I think, maybe a little bit how it's starting to absorb that flour. So I maybe even twist the whisk and then fold it a little bit. And within about 10 or 12 stirs, you should have most of that flour incorporated. Now, we don't want a bunch of lumps in here. So normally for this particular recipe at the end, I'll do a couple quick rapid stirs, and that just helps to break up any flour lumps.
Chef, I have another question.
Yeah.
So if people can't find regular flour anywhere in the stores, so what would the bread taste like if they use like almond or coconut or gluten-free flour?
Well, for almond flour is just, and all of your nut flours actually, are just finely ground nuts. So there's no gluten in there, no structure. You could make your own almond flour, throw your almonds in a food processor, grind them up. Don't go to peanut butter paste consistency, just finely ground. So you're not going to get any structure in terms of something that would rise and then hold its shape. it would just end up collapsing. This particular recipe does not rise a whole lot, a little bit, not a lot. So it may collapse a little bit, but that almonds might work well for that. Rice flour, there's some starch in there, obviously, but not enough protein to hold it structurally. Some of the substitute ones, like a lot of times made up of garbanzo beans and other mixed grains that are blended together would work, and a lot of times those have baking powder in them so that it causes a rise. But one of the things you want to do is just experiment. If you were to cut this recipe in half at home and then just experiment a couple times, I think any one of those items would make an edible product. It just might not be exactly what you're looking for. So you just have to get in there and experiment. And we all have a little bit of extra time right now. So there's your batter. That's the consistency that we're looking for. Basically like a cake batter. And you do want to bake this though as soon as you make it. You don't want to let it sit in the fridge because you're going to have some leavening going on. It'll rise up in the fridge because the moisture and the acidity in contact with the baking soda. It'll get more when it comes into contact with heat, but we want to try to capitalize on all of that lightness. And then it's up to you to decide what you want to make, right? Here's a muffin tin, 3 different size scoops. We did the same last week with cookies. It's up to you. You want a giant muffin, medium-sized muffin, or a small muffin. It depends on the pan. You can make the little ones or the large ones. I'll show you some samples of what I baked yesterday as well. So for me, I'm just going to take the blue scoop. This is probably about 1/4 of a cup. You can use tablespoons as well, works just as fine. And then I have paper. So these are your standard paper liners for a muffin tin. These are the fancier ones. You can get these at Chef's Own, which is still open. They have a little section with all of the really, really beautiful, artisanal or whatever style baking cups. So they have little loaf pans that are square, more of your high-end type product. Right? So you can put the same muffin in here as you do in here and then charge an extra 25 or 30 cents for the one that looks fancier. This is what you see in most of your fancy bake shops. We did try that here. No one bought them. We made them look really beautiful with streusel and everything on top. At the Uala Leaf Cafe, everybody just wanted the standard square wrapped in plastic. So I have a bunch in the kitchen. And then you just simply take your scoop. Always go with the level scoop if you can. Anytime you're using scoops, pick the one you need and go with the level scoop. So they're always the same, consistent. And then you just drop one in top. If you're baking without paper cups, that's fine too. Just take some spray. This is Vegeline. You can use any of your pump sprays or vegetable sprays, probably not olive oil spray, and do a simple spray of the lining. And then drop a scoop in there. So very, very simple. So here's a Pyrex pan, or I guess you call them a pan. I never worked with glass. I've always found it really weird in the kitchen because I grew up in professional kitchens. We keep as much glass as possible out of the kitchen, so we would never really use glass in there. So I don't know, someone might have left this here. So if you did, you can email me, come pick it up. Maybe it was Carolyn, I don't know. But they work great at home, it's no problem, just don't drop it. Spray it, line it, and this recipe filled this perfectly. So most of the times when you're filling something up, 3/4 is the maximum that you want to go. Muffins, loaf pans, regular cake pans, 3/4 full maximum, because you will get some rise and you don't want it overflowing into your oven and then creating a problem for you. So that particular recipe would fill this perfectly. This was about a 9 by 13, so it works well. And if I do a quick spray, try not to get my tablecloth dirty.
Chef Dan, I have 2 questions.
Yep.
One question is, what about wheat flour? And then the second question is the baking time. Is the baking time same in the glass as in the same as in the tin cupcake?
Great question. So your baking time will vary a lot. It just depends It depends on how thick it is, and I'm going to show you that with some of the finished products that I have. So this particular one here would probably take about an hour, maybe an hour and 15 minutes. The smaller muffins, 15 to 20. And again, it depends on your oven. That varies a lot. You just sort of have to watch it. But with this recipe and a lot of them, you're better off going a little bit on the lower end, temperature-wise, and a little bit longer on the time, because you don't want it burnt on the outside and then raw in the middle. That's sort of the trick. All right? So there's that one. And the other question was about flour. What aspect of the flour?
Wheat flour. What about wheat flour?
Yeah, this is wheat flour. This is all-purpose or bread. Either one works well for this particular recipe. So normally in the shop we'll use bread flour, but you can use all-purpose if you have that at home. What I would say to avoid in terms of wheat flours is the self-rising. That just means it has baking powder in it already. And we've taken care of the leavening here with our baking soda. I don't recommend baking powder, so if you're using a self-rising flour, then you end up with a baking powder mixed in with the flour on top of the baking soda, and you'll probably get something that's a lot taller than you want, might overflow, and will probably collapse as well. Because if you have too much leavening, it'll rise up too much and there's not enough structure to hold it, and it'll just fall in on itself. And we don't want that. So hopefully that answers the question there. The other thing that I'll show you, or I wanted to, at the bottom, and this is optional, it's not mandatory, is a streusel topping. Very, very simple. The one that we sell here, we don't normally put streusel on, but some people enjoy it and like it that way. That is a super simple recipe. So we've got salt, we've got sugar and flour and fat. So you can use melted butter. That's what I tend to recommend. And then it's simply mixed together to create that crumble that goes on top. I'm being told the fire alarm test is going soon, so probably in the next couple minutes. Let me quickly go through this. Flour and sugar. This can be white or brown, doesn't matter. A little pinch of salt. Mix that together. I've got a stiff whisk. A lot of the recipes also call for cinnamon. I tend to not put that in here just because I don't want everything to taste like cinnamon. It might be good in the banana bread. And then we just pour in your liquid fat. Butter would need to be melted. A lot of times this can even be done by hand, just mixing into a crumbly texture. And this adds that crunch, crispness on the top of your muffin. So you end up with a nice crumble that you can even sprinkle it on a sheet pan, bake it by itself. And if you do that, you end up with this nice crumble here. I don't know if you can hear that or not. Fire alarm. And then I just coat the top of this. And that would go in the oven. Okay. Here's the finished product. When you come back, you can see some of the different samples that I did. Here are the variety of paper cups that you can use, muffins. So I've got the larger fancy paper here, big one, some with, some without streusel. A loaf pan. I wanted to make one of these small aluminum loaf pans. These turned out really nice. I like this size. This is the perfect for a gift. A little bit larger one. You can get these at Safeway or any of your supermarkets as well. This one I did not put any of the topping on. And once it's cooled, the loaf just pops right out, and then you can simply slice it. So it depends on whether or not you want to do the larger loaf that's served in slices, or whether you want to do a larger pan. In the shop here, we tend to make it in the large hotel pan. And we use a 12-inch knife to cut it. You don't have to do that. But here, The batch recipe that we make, the one that's on there for the Uala Leaf Cafe, makes 2.5 pans. Sometimes we'll double it and actually make 5 pans. Each one of these weighs about 8 pounds. And then we just cut this into about 16 squares, wrap it up individually, and you end up with a nice thickness. So these end up being about 2 inches thick, and this takes about 1 hour and 20 minutes to bake. So all of your baking times are just going to vary. I mentioned testing it. So when it's in the oven, I always recommend a metal skewer. You can also find a lot of folks using toothpicks and whatnot, or wooden skewers, but metal tends to work better because you can see every little trace of batter that might still be on there. So as it's baking, if you're questioning whether it's done or not, you just go into the center, you pull it out, and as long as it comes out clean, then you know it's done, like most of your baked goods. So that's one of the tricks that I tend to use there. All right, were there any other questions?
Nope, you're good, Chef.
At the moment, how much time? Okay, I got
I think Jackie has a question. Wait.
Jackie has a question.
Yeah, I tried to type it in twice and nobody answered it. The question that I had way back when you were starting before the blender thing, you said buttermilk would be the best thing to use. I'm wondering if when you're about to blend it, if you put in a few drops of like lemon juice with regular milk, if that would cause the baking soda to do the baking soda thing.
Absolutely. Great question. Any acid would work great. So you get a little bit different flavor from the buttermilk, and it's not really popular in Hawaii. I don't know if any of you guys use buttermilk at home, but for batters like fried chicken, it works great. But yes, using the lemon juice as a substitute for the acidity that's in there would be perfect. Now, if you pour that into your milk and stir it, you'll probably see it curdle. It almost curdles instantly, especially if you're using whole milk, but absolutely works perfect. Yeah, no problem there at all. And that might give a little bit of lemon flavor to it, but probably not discernible to most folks.
And the other question is, I'm sorry, I was trying to type a chat when you were talking about doing something that maybe it was baking time that if you did it or didn't do it, it made a difference in whether the thing collapsed or didn't collapse, and I didn't catch that.
Yeah, your time shouldn't make a huge difference in that regard unless you pull something out too early. If you pull it out too early and it's raw, it's certainly going to collapse. But what I think I was referring to was the leavening, right? So if you get too much leavening through baking powder, or you add too much of the baking soda, or use self-rising flour and it rises a little bit too much, there may not be enough structure, and our structure comes from our eggs, our structure comes from our flour, because we don't have a lot of gluten development here because we don't mix it much, we want it tender. It can tend to collapse a little bit. So you just have to sort of watch that. Even with pans like this took about 50 minutes to bake, and the oven was at 350. I did everything at the same time. This was a better temperature for a muffin, so it's a little darker than I would like, but once you slice it, it'll be okay. But it shouldn't be an issue in terms of collapsing unless you pull it out too early, or if you over leaven, right, and it comes up too high. So,
thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, other questions?
I have another question. If you add nuts like walnuts, would that affect the baking time or temperature?
No, walnuts should not make a difference. As a matter of fact, I think the original recipe I have for this called for nuts. We don't use them here at the Uala Leaf Cafe, but walnuts in here would be outstanding. I also like chocolate chips in it. Banana bread with chocolate chips in it is awesome, but my wife doesn't like them, so I don't get to eat that very often. I make it once in a while and get scolding for it, so I go with the straight up one, but get creative. Again, you know, this is one of those things, maybe you want brown sugar instead of white sugar. Maybe you want to use a particular type of fat instead of butter or vegetable oil. I wouldn't probably use olive oil, but it might make it a creative and interesting banana bread if you were leaning more towards the savory side, you know, trying to create something like zucchini bread that's sweet, but also has a little bit of olive oil in it and maybe some sweet basil or something that goes well with bananas. So that would work. All right, and I think I have like 40 seconds left. I just want to show you a quick, super simple sourdough starter. I guess sourdough's all the rage now, or people have a lot of time at home, so they just sit around and watch like flour and water rise over the period of a week. But it's super simple to get started, and I wanted to show a basic one so that maybe next week we'll do sourdough bread or sourdough pancakes or something. I always keep a sour in the kitchen. I had to feed it yesterday because I've been neglecting it a little bit larger batch than you probably want. But what I would recommend is you just go to probably one of the best guides is like King Arthur Flour has a really good technique. Just go to their website or click on sourdough and go through theirs. It's a multi-step process. So if you started it today, you'd have a sour that's probably about ready to roll next week. So if we can take that sour and then turn it into other things. Now, the one thing I would say about their website talks about like removing and discarding some of the batter along the way, and that's to get a richer, more flavorful sour at the end of the week. But that can still be utilized. That might go banana bread. Pour flour, water, mix it. Make sure there are no lumps. Put it in a nice plastic container. I always cover it with a towel and then a rubber band or tie it with a string or something so that bugs don't get in, but yeast and air can get in. Let that sit, and then the website will tell you about the tricks to taking it out and feeding it every day. So I think next week we'll try to do a sourdough if that works, and then we can make a nice bread. There are also a couple YouTube videos from the Uala Leaf Cafe. One of them shows ciabatta bread, which is this artisan bread that's made really, really quickly. That's the fastest way to make a quality artisan style bread at home. And I still teach it to this day in the classroom always. So anyways, any other questions, or are we out of time?
I think we can, if anyone has any questions, I think we can do like 2 questions.
Okay.
If there's any. No questions? Okay.
No questions?
No questions, Chef.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. We appreciate the time that you spend on a Friday morning. Hopefully some of you will try this out this weekend. And like I said, if you don't find bananas that are overripe, you might find that bag at the end of the aisle at the supermarket. Just pop them in the oven, roast them a little bit, and they'll get nice and black and soft. Perfect for that. So have a great weekend. Happy baking, everybody. Thanks for joining us.